Hello everybody, welcome to the video. Today I'll be sharing with you all the summarized history of all of the Alliance capital cities in the game. By that I mean each of the playable races' capitals. Though do keep in mind I will not be covering the allied races, just the main Alliance races. Anyway, let's get to it. Stormwind began as one of the 7 human nations and was the farthest from the capital city of Lordaeron, being in Elwynn Forest. The first major conflict that Stormwind faced was the Gnoll Wars. The Gnolls began to unify under a single leader, known as Pack Lord Garfang. The Gnolls would attack and pillage farms and towns in Westfall and Elwynn Forest. Stormwind, being only a small nation at the time, and being rejected help from other human nations, struggled to combat this new unusual threat. One night, King Baratheon, the ruler of Stormwind at the time, sent out an elite squad, including himself, to assassinate the Pack Lord. They ventured into Red Ridge Mountains and found the Gnoll leader mostly defenseless, having sent most of his forces to attack Stormwind. They slew him, and as a result, the Gnoll army destabilized and they went back to being their unorganized and rather stupid selves, ending the Gnoll War. Not long after though, the nation started to expand their borders into Stranglethorn, which the residential Gurubashi trolls were not fond of. So, another war broke out, and King Baratheon lost his life in the conflict. Ultimately though, Stormwind did pull through and win the war, with help from the Guardian Medivh, and King Lane was now the new ruler of the nation. 20 years later, the First War broke out, and while Stormwind was relatively powerful at this point, they stood little chance against the incoming horde. They received no help from the other nations, as they thought it to just be bandit Gnoll attacks. Eventually, Stormwind did fall, and King Lane was assassinated by Garona half-Orcan, leaving the young Varian Rin to the heir of the throne. The people retreated to Lordaeron by sea, and the city's ruins now belonged to the Horde. After the Second War, the Horde was defeated and Stormwind reclaimed. Reconstruction began, but at major costs. The stonemasons guild did an excellent job at rebuilding the city, making it better than ever. However, due to the corruption of Lady Katrina Prestor, aka Anixia, the labourers were unpaid, and thus began a huge riot which Varian's wife, Tiffin, was killed in. This marked the beginning of the Devious Brotherhood, who would attempt to overthrow Stormwind City in the future, but ultimately fail. Eventually, after many years of political unrest, the Black Dragon Anixia was rooted out and slain by Varian Rin. And yes, I know there is a lot of lore I just skipped about Varian, but this video is about the city, not him.
You were too good for this world.
In Wrath of the Lich King, the city itself was mostly unchanged, but they obviously sent large military forces, known as the Alliance Expedition, to Northrend to combat the Lich King. Before the cataclysm occurred, the city was attacked by the Emerald Nightmare, but Varian Rin and others were able to neutralize the threat. As the cataclysm started, Deathwing came and destroyed large portions of the city as sort of revenge for slaying his daughter Anixia. Twilight's Hammer cultists also infiltrated the city and attempted to slay both Varian and his son Anduin, but were unsuccessful. In Mists of Pandaria, the damage caused by Deathwing was repaired, though the park destroyed by Deathwing was beyond repair, and was left as a scar in the city. In Warlords of Draenor, a large portal behind the Mage Quarter was constructed, and was connected to the Everbloom in Gorgrond. In Legion, the great king Varian Rin fell in battle to save the Alliance, and thus a grand monument was built for him and the soldiers that died at the Broken Shore. In Battle for Azeroth, the Alliance captured Prince Talanji and the Prophet Zul, but the Zandalari were rescued by members of the Horde, and in the process a portion of the city was burnt, but quickly repaired. Many Gilnean and Night Elven refugees also stay here due to the catastrophe, It happened at Teldrassil. After the Legion's second invasion of Azeroth, the Night Elves decided to make a new world tree off the coast of Darkshore as their new home. However, this time it did not grant them immortality, as Nozdormu saw their request for it again as arrogant. Later though, the world tree would slightly fall into corruption due to Xavius, but Malfurion would awaken from his dream and cleanse it. Because of this, and the tree being prosperous in general, Alexstrasza and Ysera decided to bless the tree anyway, at Tyrande and Malfurion's wedding. But Nozdormu didn't, so they're still not all immortal. During the Cataclysm, many Gilneans would settle on Teldrassil after fleeing Gilneas. The corruption mentioned earlier also appeared yet again, but thanks to the Great Dragon's blessings, it was easily routed by the player characters and other Night Elves, I guess. In Battle for Azeroth, things went to shit. Sylvanas, as war chief, got real mad and decided to have entire rule over Kalimdor, which meant destroying the Night Elf settlements in Darkshore and the World Tree itself. The Horde conquered Darkshore and Teldrassil to the disliking of many on both sides, was set ablaze and many innocents were killed. The surviving Night Elves and Gnomeregans found refuge in Stormwind and Azure Mist Isle. The time that Ironforge came to be is unknown, unfortunately, but we can start the history with the War of the Three Hammers. Ironforge used to serve as the home of all dwarves, including the Wildhammer, Bronzebeard, and Dark Iron. The kingdom was ruled by Modimus Anvilmar, but after his death, due to old age, the society fell into chaos, each clans believing they should have dominion over Ironforge. War broke out, but the Bronzebeards won, kicking out the other two clans. The Wildhammers going to Grimbertoll in the north, and the Dark Irons ventured south to a part of the Red Ridge Mountains. The Dark Irons would eventually strike out against both other clans, but ultimately fail, and in desperation, accidentally summoned Ragnaros the Firelord, turning part of Red Ridge into the searing gorge it is today, and forming the Black Rock Mountain. During the Second War, the Orcs marched north from Stormwind and found themselves in Dome Moreau. The dwarves were unprepared for such a large threat, and while they fought hard, both them and their gnome brethren were forced to stay in Ironforge, with the Orcs claiming most of Dun Moreau their own. Eventually, the Horde would fall to the Alliance of Lordaeron, and Ironforge would be freed, having both dwarves and gnomes join the Alliance. In the Third War, Ironforge would send units to help against the undead threat assaulting Lordaeron, but it would be to no avail, as the Kingdom of Lordaeron would fall to the undead and Arthas Menethil. Magni Bronzebeard, leader of the Bronzebeards at the time, would be the one to forge the legendary Ashbringer. After researching a bit too hard on Titanic history and their origins, Magni Bronzebeard fell ill to a curse that made him one with the planet, and many thought him dead. The dwarf clans later would decide to have a council rather than a sole leader, Muradin Bronzebeard representing the Bronzebeards, Falstad Wildhammer representing the Wildhammers, and Moira Thorazin, daughter of Magni, represented the Dark Irons. All went relatively well, and the Hammer of the High King, an ancient dwarven relic, was even recreated in honor of this. However, the clans did not fully trust one another yet. In Missa Pandaria, Varian needed help with the Zandalari troll threat, but the clans were reluctant to help as they were cautious of other clans backstabbing them while they diverted their attention. Only the Dark Irons would aid the king, and in turn both of the other clans were ashamed of their thoughts. In Legion, Magni Bronzebeard finally awoke, and rather than retaking his crown as sole ruler of Ironforge, he would serve as Speaker of Azeroth. After the Mechagnomes were afflicted by the curse of flesh, many would travel and take refuge in mountain caves in Dun Moraux. They focused on survival and expanding their technological prowess. The dwarves, previously the Earthen, happened upon the gnomes and seeing the kinship between their people, decided to help lay the foundations of Gnomeregan. Nothing of importance would happen until the Second War, where the Horde would attempt to siege the city. However, the gnomes were far too clever and had laid traps and explosives, making it near impossible for the orcs to claim the city. Instead, they would be held up inside the city, unable to leave. The Alliance of Lordaeron would retake Dun Moraux and free the gnomes, having them join the Alliance. During the Third War, Gnomeregan was unable to help Lordaeron due to their city being attacked by an army of trogs. The unsightly creatures were attracted to the machines of the gnomes and carved their way into the city. Gnomeregan would face this threat alone, as High-Tick and Megatork would rather have his alliance allies fighting the Scourge threat. The war with the trogs would last 5 years, but eventually Gnomeregan was overrun. Sicko Thermoplug would advise a plan to the High Tinker, radiate the lower levels of Gnomeregan to wipe out the trogs. In desperation, Megatork agreed, but the radiation affected trog and gnome alike, and it would spread further up the city. The survivors fled, and the city was lost to the trogs.
Oh, hell no!
Before the shattering, the gnomes would retake the surface near Gnomeregan and name it New
Tinkertown!
Yes, that. In-game, we go into Gnomeregan and clear out much of the trog menace, and eventually Thermoplug himself. As to why the gnomes are yet to retake the city, I'm really not sure. The Exodar was not always on the Azure Mist Isle. It in fact used to be on Draenor, the home world of the orcs. The Naru, at some point in history, travelled to Draenor with Tempest Keep, but they left it defenceless against the savage world, yet it remained untouched. That is until the Blood Elves, led by Keltha Sunstrider, found the crystalline fortress and seized control of it, as well as capturing the Naru Muuru, who would later become corrupted and turned into Entropius. Later, the Draenei, led by Velen, now on the run from the demon-controlled orcs, launched an assault on Tempest Keep in order to take over just a wing of the fortress known as the Exodar. However, prior to the assault, the Blood Elves sabotaged the Exodar, and once the Draenei activated it, the Exodar became unstable and travelled through the Twisting Nether until it reached Azeroth and crash-landed there, on a small island off the coast of Darkshore that would be known as the Azure Mist Isle. Due to the major crash of the Exodar, the power crystals from the vessel broke off and spread across the island, and the sort of radiation corrupted a lot of the wildlife, and the player characters are tasked to purge the corruption from the flora and fauna. The Exodar would undergo repairs, which are not completed until after the shattering. In Legion, the Exodar falls under siege by the Burning Legion, and Oros is slain by Velen's son, with him dying in the process. And later, the Vindicar, another vessel from the Exodar, was fully repaired, and it is the ship we use to travel to Argus. Gilneas was one of the 7 human kingdoms founded after the victory against the Trolls by the Kingdom of Arathor. In its early years, Gilneas was noted for its strong military, and eventually they would develop their own customs and traditions, just as other kingdoms did. During the Second War, Gen Greymane, son of Archibald Greymane, and ruler at the time, was so confident in his nation's military that he believed he could take on the Orcish threat alone. Thus, he only sent a token force to aid Lordaeron, and as soon as the war was over, Gilneas went back to isolation. To back this, the Greymane War was constructed, to keep out threats to the kingdom. Nobody, not even humans, were allowed into Gilneas, as Greymane wanted to seclude his kingdom from the rest of the world. However, the problem with this was that there were some Gilneans, and their land outside of the wall. Thus, they weren't allowed in. Not even refugees from the Scourge invasion were allowed in. However, the Scourge eventually did start knocking on Greymane's door. While the kingdom held the wall valiantly and very well, the undead army only grew. In desperation, Greymane requested that his court archmage, Aragol, to let loose a secret weapon on the Scourge. This weapon was the ferocious Worgen. Aragol summoned them from the Emerald Dream, and they definitely worked. They ripped the undead to shreds, but after that threat was dealt with, the Worgen themselves became the threat. They turned on the Gilneans and afflicted them with the Worgen curse, which would slowly eat away at the Gilneans in their humanity. Gilneas, by this point, was separate from the rest of the world and its troubles. The Greymane Wall, mountains, and sea shielded the nation. While many refugees went to Gilneas for help, they were only met with silence and rejection, and were left to die from wandering Worgen and Silver Pine Forest. Gilneans weren't even allowed to leave the kingdom, and the ports were closed so many sailors were stranded. These strange and rather selfish acts ignited a civil war in Gilneas. Darius Crowley, once a close friend of the king, was the one who started the feud. He, along with many armed supporters, went into Gilneas City in order to remove Gen Greymane from the throne. The civil war, known as the North Gate Rebellion, came to an end when Crowley and his forces were captured by Greymane and his troops and imprisoned. During the Cataclysm, the kingdom of Gilneas would fall under siege by 2 enemies. First, the Worgen invaded the forests of Gilneas, and their threat only grew. Led by Raylar Fangfire, the alpha of the Bloodfang Pack, they launched a massive attack on the city itself, and forced the rebels and royals from the previous civil war to reunite to combat the Worgen. The ferocious army was too much, and the people of the city were forced to retreat to Duskhaven. But not before many were afflicted by the Worgen curse, including both Greymane and Crowley. However, thanks to a Night Elf priestess, Belisra, a secret counselor of Greymane's, many cursed Gilneans learned to control their feral side and remain more human. Krenan Aranus, the court alchemist, would also find a way to restore sanity to a few feral Worgen, but the concoction was only temporary, and a more permanent fix would have to be found later, as a new threat arose. The undead, led by Sylvanas Windrunner, started a siege on the kingdom of Gilneas. The Cataclysm had ravaged the land and sea alike. This allowed the undead to attack first by sea, and later by land by breaching and sieging the Greymane Wall. As this new war raged on, much of Gilnean land was lost to the sea, including the town of Duskhaven. The Gilneans regrouped at Stormglen Village, and beseeched aid from some Night Elves to restore the sanity of many more afflicted Gilneans. Also, Lord Godfrey, a proud and rather tyrannical noble, did plan to overthrow Greymane amidst the chaos, but his plans were thwarted by the player characters, and he threw himself off a nearby cliff, rather than serving a Worgen king. Regardless, the Gilneans mustered themselves and went into Gilneas to hold off the invading undead. However, while the attempt was valiant, the city would be lost due to Horde reinforcements and the Forsaken's blight, with Prince Liam being slain by Sylvanas Windrunner in the process. The Gilneans were forced to retreat and make refuge in Darnassus, and this had brought the kingdom of Gilneas back into the alliance. Later, with the help of the Night Elves and Gnomes, the Gilneas Liberation Front and 7th Legion would retake the city, and even drive the Horde forces back to Silverpine. However, at the conclusion of the battle, Sylvanas was killed by the newly undead Lord Godfrey, and had to be resurrected by Helvalkia. But Darius Crowley's daughter, Lorna, was still in the hands of the Forsaken, and in order to save his daughter's life, forfeited the city to the Horde. Greymane has vowed to one day retake the city, but that day is yet to come. Thank you all for watching. I was originally going to make this video about each of the races in the game, so including the Horde as well, but that would have been way too long. But I might make a Horde one later on. If you liked it that much, consider subscribing, liking, and commenting and sharing as well. That would be also very helpful. Thank you.